Welcome to the Chess Assassin channel. In this video, you will learn the power of the pieces, improve your knowledge of dynamics in central tension, know how to exploit exchanges, improve your prophylactic thinking and defense, relate structures and plans, and master the exchange sacrifice. This is an analysis of the game between Grandmaster Bassem Amin and Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen. Before going directly into the game, I'm going to give you an abbreviated introductory course.
This is the variation boardroom or reference boards. Variation 1 lines after bishop b5 e6. Variation board 2 lines after bishop b5 d6. Variation board 3 lines after bishop b5 g6. And variation board 4 lines after bishop b5 knight d4. Okay, in the game Bassem Amin versus Magnus Carlsen, chess match that took place in Warsaw, Poland in 2021. Amin had the white pieces, Carlsen was playing black, and in that game, the opening began with e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Rossalimo attack, and e6 was played. Now, before I get into the game, I want to give you some ideas behind the various move candidates and their continuation. The first thing you have to understand is that strategical planning is the basis for tactical execution. We're taking a look at d6 first. White castles, bishop d7. Now, for the moment, this development pattern is logical. Since the light square bishop coincides with the placement of the pawns on e7, d6, and c5. Your strategy, let's say, for example, that after rook e1, your strategy is to challenge this pawn, white's pawn on e4. And you're planning to push this pawn to e6, followed by d5, in order to challenge white's pawn on e4. So that means that you're going to place these pawns on light squares. But at the same time, you want to try to develop this bishop on d7 to a good square. So you're planning to play a e6 and d5, but you don't want your bishop locked in behind the pawns. So adopting the strategy, you know that bishop from c8 is known as the problem child bishop. You want to try to get that bishop developed to an effective square. So if your strategy is to play e6 and d5, you want to put the question to white's bishop on b5 by playing a6. If bishop takes knight, then you can recapture with the bishop, aiming for this pawn. But white retreats the bishop to f1. And now bishop g4. Now you're able to carry out your plan of pushing these pawns to challenge white's pawn on e4. You have developed your bishop outside of the pawn chain. And the line continues c3, e6, d4. C takes d4, c takes d4. Now you are pressuring white's pawn on d4. The knight on f3 is pinned. So bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Now it is white who is inflicted with double pawns. And the line continues d5. And now this bishop on f8 is a good bishop along that diagonal. You got rid of the bad bishop, or a would-be bad bishop, and now you have another good bishop on f8. So the lesson here is strategical planning is the basis for tactical execution, and 2, positional understanding comes with playing. Knight c3, and then knight f6. Now the question is, does white get compensation for the double pawns? Let's continue. Bishop g5, threatening to push this pawn, while this bishop is pinning the knight. Bishop e7, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now e takes d5. Now taking a look at G6. This is the modern way to handle the black side. Now in this line, black needs to ask himself, which side am I going to place my king? In this line, black wants control along with this pawn controlling this square. Plans to push the E pawn twice. And also another goal for black in this position is to attack this pawn. And generally, black at some point is going to advance this pawn 2 squares. Bishop takes c6, so white decided to remove the defender, and d takes c6. Now capturing this way, it only makes sense for black to develop the knight from f6 to d7, knight f6 to d7, which is consistent with black's development of the bishop to g7, and the queen will later go to the e file to pressure white's e pawn. d3. Now from here, white can choose the very simple plan, bolster the e4 pawn by playing the pawn to d3, castle, and play h3 to keep a piece off g4, and finally follow up with bishop e3 and queen d2, with the idea of trading off black's flank bishop on the king's side. Bishop g7, h3, knight f6, knight c3, and knight d7. Black defends c5 and prepares e5 to increase his control over d4. Bishop e3, e5, queen d2, and h6, keeping the bishop off this diagonal, because now the rook controls that along with the bishop. Castle king side, queen to e7, with ideas such as f5, pawn to c4, etc. Knight h2. White has a plan of his own, which is to push this pawn 2 squares, opening up the f file. So, as a result, black chooses to castle this way. A queenside castle attacking in the center. b6, rook on a to e1, bishop b7, f4. Now black castles queenside, and knight f3, rook f to e8, Bishop f2, c4. Now notice how this rook x-rays the opponent's queen here. And at the same time, you have this bishop attacking along this diagonal, x-ray this knight here. And you have this pawn already pressuring white's pawn there. Okay, continuing. d4. E takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Now exploiting the pin on the queen. Knight c5. So now you have this piece, both pressuring d4. Queen e3. Bishop takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight takes e4.
If queen takes e4, then black wins by queen takes e4, rook takes e4, c5.
And the move is f5. So after white removes the knight that's under attack, the only thing that's defending this knight is this queen. So rook takes. Let's go back for a minute. Removes this knight. Then queen takes e3. Rook takes e3. And rook takes d4.
Now, after playing the bishop to b5, and black plays knight to d4, white's plan is very simple. Let's take it back. The knight here controls e5 and d4. But by playing the knight to d4, black is no longer controlling this square or this square except for this pawn. Therefore, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and white is well ahead in development and ready to take over the center with moves such as pawn to c3, followed by c takes d4, or d takes c3, followed by knight takes c3. So a good plan for white here is to try and reinforce control over these two squares. For instance, white castles king side, and now e6. d3, a6, bishop a4, b5. And this move is played so that black will be able to advance the d pawn to d5. Bishop b3, bishop b7, knight d2, knight f6, a4, queen b6. Guarding this pawn here, knight f3, applying pressure to the pawn there. Bishop b7, bishop f4, reinforcing control over the e5 square. d6, nullifying the power of white's bishop along this diagonal. A takes b5, a takes b5, trade of rooks on a8, bishop recaptures on a8, and now queen d2. Queen c5, queen a5, castle, bishop to d2 with the idea of bringing the bishop here. d5, and now e5. White is now controlling d6, f6. The knight guards the pawn here. This is a target for white. White also applies pressure to the pawn on b5. And black may have a problem with these double pawns here. This pawn remains a liability for black. The knight on f6 has to move. h4, taking the dark squares away from black's bishop on e7. And now let's get to our game. So the opening started with e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, e6. Castle king side, knight g to e7, rook e1, b6. c3. The thing that's good about c3 is that should black play the pawn to a6, then white can retreat the bishop to a4, and after b5, white would be able to retreat the bishop to c2 without having to worry about being caught by the Noah's Ark trap after pawn to b5 and pawn to c4, trapping the bishop. So the bishop has room to escape. a6, bishop a4, and c4. Knight a3, b5. So there's a saying that goes, the player who grabs the most space has more perspective and increases his chances of winning. Bishop c2. Now this pawn on e4 is a target for black. What white wants to do is possibly advance the pawn to d4 with the idea of gaining more control on the e5 square along with the knight on f3. And the game continued. Knight g6. b3. Knight on c to e5. B takes c4. B takes c4. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5 and queen e2, targeting the pawn on c4. Queen c7. Rook f1. White has ideas such as advancing the pawn from f2 to f4, gaining space there. g5, or slows down the advance of the f-pawn. Rook b1, bishop b7. This is a very good bishop for black, who has the intention of opening up this diagonal with moves such as either pawn to d5 or pawn to f5. And this bishop continues to control both diagonals from f8. The move played in the game was d4. Another interesting line is knight takes c4. Now it looks as though white is giving a piece away, but then this rook here aims at the bishop on b7. And one line continues, knight takes c4, rook takes b7, an exchange sacrifice, queen takes b7, and queen takes c4, with the idea of having two bishops and the queen is somewhat centralized and has access to the dark squares along here, where the queen would be attacking the rook on h8. The queen can also swing back to e2, having access along the h-file to the king, possibly advancing this pawn to open up the f-file, aiming for this square. Rook c8, queen e2, queen b6, and bishop b3. Bishop g7, bishop a3, queen a5, bishop b4, queen b5, offering the trade of queens. Queen e3, bishop f8, trade of bishops. d4, a5, c4, queen b4, c5. a4, bishop c2, queen c4, bishop d3, queen takes a2. Black has this pawn on a4, 3 squares away from promotion. Move the king to e7 so that the other rook can have access along the rank, and swing the rook over to help guard either the pawn or occupy the open b file. Queen takes g5, rook g8, queen h6 check, rook g7, rook b1, queen a3, attacking this bishop, queen d2, e5, attacking the pawn at its base. g3, e takes d4, bishop a6, rook e8. Now, the queen attacks the pawn on c5 that is undefended, and the rook attacks the pawn on e4 that is undefended. Queen takes d4, defending both pawns. Rook g5, rook b5, and queen f3, double attacking the pawn on e4. d4 was played in the game, and the game continued. C takes d3 en passant, bishop takes d3, and now bishop e7. Another line to consider is queen takes c3. The knight and the queen both double attacks the bishop on d3. But at the same time, the rook on b1 attacks the bishop on b7. And another thing to look at is that this bishop on f8 aims for the knight on a3, having only one defender, which is this bishop on c1. So if rook takes b7, black can continue with queen takes d3. But the line goes rook d1 defending the bishop. Now black has to take action. Knight takes d3. Rook takes d3. Queen c6, keeping the queen and bishop battery along the a8 to h1 diagonal. Rook d4, queen c7, knight c4, bishop c5, rook d1, bishop c6, bishop takes g5, and now bishop b5. Now there's a threat here. The threat now is bishop takes c4, and if queen takes c4, then bishop takes f2 check, winning the queen on c4. So rook on d to c1, rook g8, bishop d2, rook g6, a4. White wants to eliminate one of black's bishops, a long-term advantage that comes to fruit in the endgame. Continuing, bishop c6 and knight a5, queen d6, knight takes c6, d takes c6, e5, and queen d5, threatening checkmate on g2. g3. Here, black tries to solve the problem of the weak pawn on c6 by placing the bishop on d4 and advancing the pawn to c5, setting up somewhat of a fortress. And this is followed up with rook d8. For instance, bishop d4, bishop f4 defending the pawn on e5, king f8, h4, c5, h5, and next is rook d8, doubling the queen and rook on the d file. Rook g8, rook b6, and rook d8. h6, king e7. So the queen controls the a8 to h1 diagonal. The pawn and bishop protect each other. The queen and rook doubled on a d file, and the other rook is on g8, x-raying the king on g1. So for the moment, the king is safe on the e7 square. a5, rook d7, rook takes a6, rook b8, rook b6, rook on d to b7, rook takes b7, rook takes b7, queen g4, and bishop takes e5. So after bishop e7, the game continued. Knight c4, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, castle, king side, and bishop e3. Another interesting move is e5. The knight has influence on dark squares such as a5, b6, d6, and e5. The dark square bishop eyes the pawn on g5. The knight attacks the pawn on e5. And white can swing the rook over from f1 to e1. And the line continues bishop c6, a4, and now black has bishop takes a4 or rook on a to c8. Bishop takes a4 is answered by knight b6, forking these two pieces. Bishop b5, queen to g3. Bishop takes f1 or queen takes b6. Let's look at bishop takes f1 first. So capturing the rook on f1. Knight takes a8. Rook takes a8. Bishop takes g5. Bishop takes g5. Queen takes g5 check. King f8 and rook takes f1. And black has this annoying outside pass pawn. White will have to continue looking for checks. Alright, taking the moves back. And the other move, queen takes b6. So white sacrificed the knight for an attack on the king's side, and the line continues. Bishop takes g5, threatening a discovery and a capture. King g8. Bishop takes e7, f5, and c4. White will regain the piece. Queen d4, c takes b5, f4. Queen f3. So now the queen aims at the rook on a8, while at the same time the bishop threatens the rook on f8. Queen takes e5. Bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, and b takes a6 with a pawn on the 6th rank. And in this line, white is much better. White played bishop to e3. Bishop c6 and knight d2. a5, and c4. Rook on a to b8, and now knight b3 and knight f3 were the two main options in this line. Now knight to b3 was played in the game. The other option, knight f3. Continuing with the trade of rooks on b1, rook b8, bishop takes g5, rook takes b1 check, queen takes b1, bishop takes g5, knight takes g5. With the idea of perhaps threatening to push this pawn, opening up the diagonal for the queen along here, which would double attack the pawn along with the knight and the queen. Queen f4 attacking the knight. Knight f3. Bishop takes e4, queen e1. a4. Queen d2, queen takes d2. Knight takes d2, bishop c6. Now in this position, we have a bishop versus knight endgame. Black does have 3 connected pawns. Outside pawn over here on the queen's side, and this isolated pawn. So 3 pawn islands. White as well has 3 pawn islands. Getting back to our game. So knight b3 was played in the game. Continuing. Queen d6, offering the trade of queens. White accepted. Queen takes d6. Bishop takes d6. f3. a4. Knight d4. Bishop c5. King f2. Rook takes b1. Rook takes b1. Bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4. f6. King e3. King f7. h4 and h6. H takes g5. H takes g5. Rook h1. King g6. Not allowing white's rook to access any of the ranks in black's territory. g3, rook b8, and king d3 was played. e5, threatening the bishop. Bishop c3, g4. In the game, white played the pawn to f4. I personally don't like this move because after e takes f4, it opens up the e file for black's rook to swing over to e8. And you'll have the rook and the bishop pressuring the pawn on e4. Taking a look at F takes G4, followed by King G5. And to this, white would respond with Rook F1. And after King takes G4, Rook takes F6, Rook B1, and Bishop takes E5, protecting the pawn on G3. And here it is white who's winning the position, because notice that the rook on B1 cannot slide over to A1, cannot move to B2 because the bishop controls that diagonal. And the pawn on G3 is safe, and this rook can swing over and check the king on from G6. So after F takes G4, King G5, Rook F1. And let's say the king does not take the pawn on G4, but instead black plays the rook over to F8. Then the tactic is bishop takes E5, and black cannot recapture unless he loses the rook on F8. And lastly, the king moves to G6, after which white would respond with Rook D1, and the line continues Bishop A8, Rook F1, A3, Rook F5, Rook C8, Bishop D2, Bishop B7, Rook F1, Bishop A6, double attacking the pawn on C4, Rook C1, Rook B8, Rook C3, Rook B6, Bishop B3, attacking the rook on B6, Rook C6, Rook C1, Bishop B7, King C3, Rook C7, opening up the bishop's range on this pawn here. King D3 and Rook C6 looks about even. So in the game, white played F4, and now EF4, GF4, Rook E8, double attacking the pawn here. F5 check, King G7. Of course, the king has to go to G7. Otherwise, if King G5, then Bishop D2 is checkmate. So, King G7, Rook E1, King F7. E5. F takes E5, Rook takes E5, Rook G8. Following the general in-game principle of rooks belong not only on open files but behind passed pawns. Rook E1, G3, Bishop D4, G2, F6, Rook G3 check, King D2, Rook G4, king d3, king g6, a3, rook g3 check. Played in the game was bishop to e3. Now this is understanding the power of the pieces. You have the rook pinning the bishop to white's king. The bishop and the pawn guard each other on c6 and d7. Very strong bishop. The pawn threatens to go to g1 to promotion. The king attacks the pawn on f6 and guards the f7 square. And in the game, the king is also a fighting piece. And x-raying the pawn on a3 is the rook on g3. So after bishop e3, king takes f6. And the game continued. King e2. Now the king is making his way here. King f2. Rook f3 check. King e2. King e4. And king d2. Rook takes e3. Rook takes e3. And king f4. Now when a pawn is on either the 6th or the 7th rank, it's equivalent to a piece. Black's pawn on g2 is equivalent to a piece. So king f4 was played. White has to guard the first rank. So now White's rook is tied down to defense. King f3. c5. King f2. Rook e2 check. King g3. And after rook e3 check, king h2, and white conceded the game. Thank you for watching. That is all I have. Stay tuned for my next video.